Hello, I'm Susan Rosenberg, a trustee with the Asbury Park Historical Society. We're standing at our headquarters, which is the former home of Stephen Crane. Let's start with Asbury Park. Asbury Park was founded in 1871 when James Bradley bought 3 tracts of land, one of which was Asbury Park. He created a grid in this town that included Bradley lots that were 50 by 150 feet, and we're standing on one of those. This house was built in 1878 and through time was owned by 25 deed owners. In 1995, the house was so derelict there were homeless people living here. Through the goodness of Tom Hayes, who purchased this house and salvaged it from being razed, he knew that Stephen Crane had lived here. He resurrected it and created a cultural center for the community. Then, after Tom Hayes, his neighbor Frank D'Alessandro owned it and continued the community cultural events that still go on here. In 2015, this house was added to both state and national registries of historic places. And that's where we are today. Won't you come in, and I'd like to show you inside. The Stephen Crane house isn't known for its beauty. It is authentic, but it is known for the people who lived here. The Cranes moved here in 1883. The family came from Newark. That's where Stephen was born and raised until he was 12 years old when he came here. In fact, his mother was a widow. His father had died, and that's why I'm wearing this mourning outfit. And Mrs. Crane brought Agnes and Stephen, and they resided here. Stephen Crane was the 14th child of Mrs. Crane, and Agnes, his sister, was his mentor. In many ways, she was not only a surrogate mother, but she encouraged Stephen to write. His mother was a writer too, and Mrs. Crane was also the president of the local Women's Christian Temperance Union. We're in the parlor of the Stephen Crane house. It's been rehabilitated. You'll hear about that in a minute, but I'm so grateful to be able to introduce you to Tom Hayes, who saved our house in 1995.
Yes, so thank you, Susan. I appreciate that. Yeah, it was quite a feat to get involved with the Crane house at the time, before it was even the Crane house. It was just an abandoned property here in Asbury Park, and my wife Regina and I had lived in Asbury Park since the late 80s. Back in that day, people were just not really interested in Asbury Park at all. And in fact, as we've talked in the past, it was probably Asbury Park's lowest period in time, in history. But nonetheless, a neighbor a couple of doors down from the Crane house mentioned to me that he thought that Stephen Crane used to live in this house. And I was like, Stephen Crane? And he reminded me of the Red Badger Courage. I was like, oh yeah, I had to read that in high school, all those wonderful things. So, but I couldn't believe it. I said, how could such an historic person have lived in the home in Asbury Park and there's not even a sign on the building or anything, right? So I did some research at Syracuse University because I heard he attended there. And lo and behold, found all this information and eventually came across a photo of the home. It's like, my gosh, it is like the former childhood home of Stephen Crane. So that's when things started. I tried to connect with other organizations because the home was for sale. Again, it was abandoned and boarded up, or not boarded up yet, but abandoned. And we're just trying to see if somebody would be interested in buying it and saving yet another piece of history of Asbury Park before it's gone. And we tried and could not find anyone to do it. So my wife and I made the decision to try to buy it ourselves, at least save it. We didn't know what the heck we were going to do with it. It's not in any of our backgrounds to be like owning a museum or anything like that. But here we were, just a small, young, poor family in Asbury Park, just trying to keep a piece of history. So after some gyrations, we ended up getting the property and saving it from that perspective, which was great. And then the next step was then trying to make a museum. And that was a very difficult process with the town, not the mayor and council at the time, but the staff, the folks, that do all the applications and things like that. It was really a tough battle, but we eventually won. And we also hoped that it would become a community, the home for the community in Asbury Park and the world for that matter. Anybody that was interested in Stephen Crane or his writings or history, that sort of thing. So that started that whole process, and we needed to do a little bit of fundraising and stuff. All this stuff was new to us, and again, it was my wife and I, and we have three young children. And in fact, my daughter, who was probably 2 at the time, we have photos of her painting the porch in her diaper, because that's the labor that we could afford.
Who else did you have working here?
Well, we had Werner Baumgartner, who's a local historian, did so much here with us. He was such a great guy to have. I worked for New Jersey Natural Gas, so we had some of our volunteers were able to come out and help too, which was big, because when you have to try to paint a building of this size and magnitude, you need a lot of hands on deck. So, I appreciated those folks. A lot of local folks that just were involved at the time, tried to come out and help. We had the Boy Scouts come out and do some things. Yep, and there was a lot of folks that were willing to help out. We started doing one particular fundraiser that I think was interesting was with a friend of ours. Her name was Midge Guerrera, and she was very good at theater and things like that. So she wrote the whole script and everything for the Crane Chronicles, which was a whole history of the Stephen Crane family, not just Stephen Crane, but his mother. I mean, every one of those family members were very interesting. And it was a large family. He was one of many children, the youngest of many children. And then we did other things, and eventually we did poetry readings, and our good friend and neighbor, Frank D'Alessandro, got involved with us then, and he loved Edgar Allan Poe and would do Edgar Allan Poe poetry readings right in this room, right in this parlor. What a great man, because as you know, the history as it went on, he ended up, purchasing the home from us and allowing us to, what's that, in 2001? Yep, and he really did some amazing things at that point and forward. But during the time we owned it, it was just, again, always trying to keep the doors open to an extent. The place needed a roof. There was water leaking everywhere. There was broken windows. It needed everything. And as I've said before in past, that this building had so few upgrades for the time period to be in them, like the 1990s, and have like 5 or 6 outlets throughout the entire 22-room home is crazy, right? And a couple of ceiling lights with pull chains like the one we have in this room. And it was just pretty much intact, which was really odd but spectacular, because it's such a historical property, and it's amazing to be able to say that we have the original windows, and so much of the original work that was done all through the years. And although there were additions and things like that, each time it was pretty much intact. So we wanted it to be a real asset for the city and the community, and it's exceeded our wildest imaginations, because now it is the home of the Asbury Park Historical Society. It's on the National Historic Register of Historic Places. There's so many wonderful things, and it is being used as a community space. Community groups can come in and meet with the Asbury Park Historical Society and others, and the events, and it's so moving in the right direction. And again, a lot of times I'm here in the middle of the night working on the house, and she's home with the 3 kids. And back then there were no cell phones, so at 4 a.m, when I'm still working on this place, she's worrying that I'm like, am I dead in here or something? But the things you have to do to make things happen. And then again, to have folks like Werner involved, Werner Baumgartner, and then Frank D'Alessandro to come along and purchase it from us, and took it to, again, tremendous levels. He was just such a good steward of the property. And again, who would have thought that could have really worked out that way? It's just amazing. So here we are today, and I'm really grateful that we've gotten this far, and that the home is doing so well, and all the upgrades that have been happening here that are, historically in timing with the historical aspect of what they should be, like wallpapers and things like that. So, it's kept intact, but just improved and polished now, I would say, so kudos to your whole organization, by the way, for doing all that.
Well, thank you. And credit goes to Jim Henry, who has been getting grants to rehabilitate And we're going to hear from him now to see what we have been doing and continue to do.
Well, that's spectacular.
Okay, so Jim Henry is with me. He's a fellow trustee, and he has been in charge of the rehabilitation of the Stephen Crane House.
The first grant that we applied for was for the reconstruction of the foyer. This room that we're in right now is the parlor, and it was not covered by a grant. The Historical Society paid out of pocket for this restoration of this particular room. This room was in really bad shape. A lot of the plaster in the ceiling was cracked and loose. If you look around, you see that this is a pretty good looking room at this time. If you look around, you see there's these two big windows, and you see that there's 3 doors, and you'll notice that these doors have a lot of window panes. And all this work was done. These things were all repainted, scraped, repainted, repaired as part of the restoration of this room. The wallpaper probably was not on the original room, but somebody at a later time had put some wallpaper on the ceiling, and we found traces of the old wallpaper there. But this wallpaper is appropriate to the late 1800s, 1900 time frame. When you take a look at the windows here on the north side of this room, you'll see that they are a floor-to-ceiling. And you can open these windows. They slide up into pockets up into the, that goes up to the second floor. And these windows in the summertime were designed so that you could walk out of this room and onto the porch out front. However, when this house was built, that porch wasn't there. And the entrance that you find here on the north side of the house was not there as well. The entrance was on the west side of the house, and you can see when you get into some of these little rooms off the main rooms here, you can see the outside, the clapboard construction of the house. If you look at this light fixture, when this house was built, it had no electricity in it. And this light fixture is period appropriate. The former president of the Historical Society acquired it, particularly for this room, because we're trying to make this room look a little grander than it really was when it was first constructed.
We're in the lecture room, and I'm happy to introduce to you Tom Chesick, a trustee and program director of the Stephen Crane House.
Okay, thank you, Susan. As she mentioned, we are coming to you from the lecture room, our little in-house theater here at the Stephen Crane House. It's been called one of Asbury Park's best-kept secrets, and it's a space that was created from the old original dining room of the house and a smaller adjoining room by Frank D'Alessandro, who was the previous private owner of the Stephen Crane House. Frank envisioned a black box-style performance space that could host film screenings, plays, poetry readings, author appearances, music recitals, writers' workshops. And for some 20 years, this room has served as a community resource for all of those things and more, including school group tours, meetings of civic groups, and nonprofit organizations. Now, under the stewardship of the Asbury Park Historical Society, we've continued to honor the creative and journalistic legacy of Stephen Crane and his family, with events that have included a long-running series of classic movie matinees and other special screenings, many of them dedicated to the works of famous literary figures, or sometimes with special guests like the late and locally based film actress Norma Eberhardt. Our plays have included some that have gone on to off-Broadway runs after being seen here in this room for the first time anywhere. And we've done original radio-style adaptations of Crane stories, and one-person dramas about everybody from Eleanor Roosevelt and Harriet Tubman to Lizzie Borden, and at the end of 2019, an exclusive New Jersey engagement of An Evening with Stephen Crane. And our guests have ranged from United States congressmen, Tony-nominated actors, to multiple award winner Bryan Cranston. And this room has served as a setting for memorial services, weddings, national TV shows, and even a horror film crew who found it a suitably macabre scene. And all through the years, our popular public events have helped raise some much-needed cash for a variety of locally based organizations and initiatives. Now, of course, being director of programming means that the ongoing public health emergency of the past 10 months has forced us to suspend our entire slate of happenings here at the Crane House for the time being. But we've taken that opportunity to give the lecture room a bit of a freshening up towards the day that we can once again welcome people into our home. So recent months have seen the installation of an all-new lighting system, an expanded seating layout that can accommodate more than 40 audience members comfortably, as well as a new coat of paint, a newly refinished floor, and other improvements that are designed to enhance the comfort and enjoyment of our guests. It's a work in progress, one that we're very excited about. And while we are unable at this time to announce a specific new schedule of events for 2021, we invite you to check our official website, follow our social media accounts, get on our email list, and pick up the weekly Coaster newspaper for updates as they occur. So here's looking ahead to the next time that we can welcome you to our home and to our newly refurbished lecture room theater during this milestone year in the Crane House's history. Thank you.
Jim Henry, here we are in what we think is Stephen's room. Could you tell us about the rehabilitation here?
Well, yes, I hope. The reason we think it's Stephen's room is because it's part of the original house, but it is also the smallest bedroom in the house. And Stephen being the youngest, he would have gotten the smallest bedroom. The repairs and restoration of this room was by a grant from the Monmouth County Historical Commission. And we had our plasterer, Jerry, come in, and he did a pretty good job of restoring this with the, it's pretty hard to see what was original and what has been repaired and replaced. We also did the floor in here. As you can see, it's newly sanded and refinished. But this, as I said, this room was in better shape than most of the other rooms. There wasn't as much plaster work that had to be done, but one of the things that Jerry did when he was plastering, in order to save a lot of the original plaster, there's a technique where they anchor the old plaster with a certain type of screw that they have developed here for that particular purpose. And Jerry was able to save a lot of the original plaster when he came into work.
Wow.
We're trying to furnish this room with furniture that would have been appropriate to this time period. This desk that we're looking at here right now is also the type of a desk that would have been used in that same time period. The bed frame that we're talking about here is also that time period. And as a matter of fact, if you look in the 1902 Sears Roebuck catalog, you can find that bed frame. But again, we feel this room was Stephen's because of its size, and he being the youngest would have gotten the smallest bedroom.
Where do we go from here with our rehabilitation?
Well, I hope that in the near future we can add a couple more rooms to the calendar that says that we've renovated these rooms and we're back to what they should have looked like 150 years ago.
We're working on it.
Yes, we are.
We're now in the rehabilitated library of the Stephen Crane House, and I'm honored to present Don Stein, our former president of the Asbury Park Historical Society, whose vision saw to it that we got this showcase. So I give it to Don.
Okay, thank you, Susan. Since early on, the house did have a library, but it was a hodgepodge of books and furniture and that type of thing. And always in the back of my mind, I thought, like, if you're going to have a house honoring Stephen Crane, then you really need to pay homage to his works and let people understand what an important American author he was, what an important writer. And so we came up with this idea to we redid the whole room, the ceilings, the walls, the floor, everything. We put in new wiring, and we had these cases built right here in Asbury Park, special cases, so we could showcase the works of Stephen Crane, which, is important, obviously, in understanding the man himself. Stephen Crane was an important author, and I'm going to go over here and read a quote from Ernest Hemingway from the Green Hills of Africa. And Hemingway said, "The good writers are Henry James, Stephen Crane, and Mark Twain. That's not the order they're good in. There's no order for good writers." And that's what he said in the Green Hills of Africa. And Crane was known for naturalism or impressionism, which was a reaction against romanticism. And it was finally putting into novels the reality of day-to-day situations and people that, people before probably didn't want to read about even. But, and one of the perfect examples of this are over here. His first book actually was Maggie, A Girl of the Streets. And it's a very tame version by today's standards of, an Irish immigrant girl in New York in the Bowery getting lured into prostitution. And this was his first book. And since he was came from such a Methodist family, he wrote it under a pseudonym, Johnston Smith. So his name wasn't associated with it originally. And like I say, so we have the books, or at least the best examples we can get of the books, and we have information about them. And and this was one of the early examples of literary realism. And obviously it didn't sell that well. And he wrote this when he was 22. And he had 1,100 copies printed in paper wraps, and this is an example of it here, just a picture, because the book itself is rare enough. So he had 1,100 copies printed, but only 35 copies are known to exist, and 28 are in institutional libraries. So Maggie is rarer than a Gutenberg's Bible to find a copy of Maggie, A Girl of the Streets. And then he came out with The Red Badge of Courage, which is this book. I'll show you a copy. This is a first edition of Red Badge of Courage, and that's what it would have looked like when you went out and bought it when it was published. And the Red Badge of Courage is a story about the Civil War and a young man's entry into the Civil War in the Union Army. And the Red Badge of Courage is the blood. He wishes that he had shed his blood and shown his red badge of courage. And this novel took off immediately upon its publication. It became a bestseller, and it has never been out of print since the time it was published. And so today you can still get copies of the Red Badge of Courage. And this is what launched Stephen Crane's career. And ironically, it's considered one of the best Civil War stories ever written, but Stephen Crane had never participated in the Civil War. So this was kind of just written from his secondhand knowledge, but includes realistic battle sequences and that type of thing. And it reflects the inner experience of a young man fleeing from battle in the Civil War and not giving his red badge of courage. And then he went on, and this was his first book of poetry, which is called The Black Riders. And this was his first serious venture into poetry. And the Black Riders were actually images he imagined in the waves breaking in Ocean Grove, New Jersey. These were the Black Riders, and he got that imagery out of the waves breaking in Ocean Grove. It contains 68 short poems, sparse. He was 23 years old when he wrote it, and that was his first book of poetry. Then he went on and started writing other books. George's Mother, The Little Regiment, another Civil War novel, and The Open Boat and Other Tales. So these are short stories, and this is his account of his adventures upon the sinking of the SS Commodore in 1897, which was during the Cuban-American War. He was a newspaper correspondent then, and it's considered one of his best stories. It's autobiographical in nature, but it's a principal example of literary naturalism, this story. And it's one of his most frequently discussed works. And then he went on to write War is Kind, which has drawings by Will Bradley, who was a very famous artist at the time, a cartoonist, illustrator, decorator. And this is his other collection of poetry. And then right after this, he died. And he did have a couple of subsequent books published. And one of them is Wounds in the Rain, which is a collection of short stories that focuses on his time in the Cuban-American War, Spanish-American War. And then he had a novel called The O. Rudy, and he died before it was finished, and it was finished by this author named Robert Barr. And when I was putting this collection together, I was trying to get first edition copies, but if I couldn't afford them, I was trying to get copies that looked exactly like the first edition, even though they were later printed. So we're representing the way the original first edition looked. And I went online and I found this copy of the O. Rudy, and I paid like $23 for it, I think. And I opened it up, and this is a first edition, and it says, from Townley Crane to Townley Crane from his sister. Now, Townley Crane was Crane's older brother. And he's the reason they moved to Asbury, because Townley was already here. And his sister at the time, that was Mary Helen Crane. Okay, that was his older sister and the only surviving sister at that time. So this is a gift to Townley from his sister of their deceased brother's book. And it's a shame that Stephen Crane died as young as he did, because it'd be very interesting to see what he could have done during a much longer writing career. But for the little time that he was here, he made an outstanding contribution to American literature and changed American literature, and a lot of 20th century novelists autograph stuff. This is Stephen Crane's earliest known autograph. So this is our little room that pays homage to Stephen Crane's literary works.
That was fabulous, Don. Thank you so much for the overview of Stephen Crane. And I just want to say to everybody that to this day, Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage is required reading in many high schools. And lastly, please come by for a visit. We're open every Sunday from 12 to 2, 508 4th Avenue, and we're also available online, aphistoricalsociety.org. Thank you so much for listening to this.